Hello, and welcome to BonkTable. This is the second episode of Storytime, so I got a lot of feedback from the first one. A lot of it was positive, a lot of people enjoyed it, a lot of it was like, hey, you should do this to make it better. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll do that. So I've done a little bit of improvements on like the back end, maybe stuff you guys won't really hear, but more of this makes it a lot easier to record because, oh my god, I did that all in one day. If you would like to submit something to this, because I had a couple requests for that, just send in your raw audio. You don't have to edit it, I'll do it for you. Send in the name of the story you did and the link to the story so I can make sure it's all lined up and there isn't anything weird going on. And yeah, enjoy Storytime, episode 2. Stories of Ea, 100 Kingdoms, Dawn and Dusk. Every dawn and every dusk, you make them suit up, stand still, stare ahead, and listen to their officers. Give the same reports. Reports, I might add, that are on your desk anyway. She sighed to emphasize the tediousness of it all. Because it was tedious, by the aspects, it was almost as tedious as her earlier training chores. They were supposed to instill humility, self-control, and she suspected obedience. She could not be sure, however. She never really learned the last part very well, or had she? She realized she had kept her voice low so as for the troops to not hear her, like he had asked. The thought annoyed her. Then the morning inspections she went on, raising her voice a little just to make a point to herself, if to no one else. Do you realize the absurdity of it? Hello, you metal-clad giant sword-wielding killing machines? Did you make your bed this morning? The infuriatingly predictable man seemed to ignore her, instead nodding his command at his troops, with that unusual strict expression which looked sculpted on his face, rather than worn. The man seemed to respond to his demeanor, she admitted. In a diplomatic meeting or a ballroom, he would be no different than the weaponry on display. Equally eloquent as a speaker and an awkward reminder of alternatives that ruined the mood for everyone. But here, a single nod would soon move the entire congregation as if the slightest movement of his head or a slight change in his expression had the sound of dozens of metal boots echoing in thunderous clatter. He had also devised great ways for her magic to complement his troops, and vice versa. She admired that, perhaps as much as she hated the repetitive drills on them. Wait! Weaponry on display, her eyes widened and her fingers started tapping her sides nervously, as she let her mind wander to the scrying devices she had planted. He did not ignore her, but she would have to wait. There were procedures. With his leave given in a sharp nod, his sergeants bellowed "At ease" command that echoed in the silence of the growing twilight. With metal boots following in thunderous clatter, it was familiarly comforting sound that he had accompanied his own dusk and dawns for decades. It is about discipline, order, small accomplishments, he replied in the end, clasping his hands behind his back as they turned and started climbing the stairs back to the command post. One of my commanders once told me that if you wanted to change the world, start by making your bed. His uncle had insisted on bringing a mage to his troops. A stout imperialist, the Duke wished to support the imperial institutions as well as to add the prestige and power of the chapters to his retinue. An imperialist Dheukorro himself, he had supported the idea, but the Elomancer was proving to be a challenge for him. As quick to action as she was to boredom, her magic was, he admitted to himself, a powerful addition to his uncle's forces. Not to mention, she often provided an entirely different point of view than his, with a keen mind for strategy, even if unorthodox. A valued asset surely, even if his strict military mindset was thrown off balance. By her demeanor, and his disciplined nature often could not shake an uneasy feeling in her presence. He made a mental note to add even more exercises for her and his men in the drill schedule. If they shared such feelings, he needed to be sure they were used to her presence and methods on the field. One of mine said something else, she retorted. There it was again, a total shift in both attitude and subject. Her voice was blunt, distant even. The joking irony that dressed it before now gone entirely, as she stared in the distance, tapping her leg rhythmically with her left hand. He frowned, his spine shivering uncomfortably by the sudden mood change before she went on, turning to speak to him as if focused on the conversation again. Her hand stopped tapping as well, now motioning while she spoke as was her custom. He said, "A settled mind makes a blind eye. I think both yours and your uncle's are too settled to see that your dear cousin's is hosting one too many soirees attended by the sovereign, friendly knights, even as we speak." He frowned, surprised. "What would you suggest?" he asked solemnly. "I would suggest we attend with a small escort guard, of course," she answered, as the sun set behind them, painting sky, helms, and steel swords in bloody red. Stories of Ea, Spires, the Arena. "That is my skull," the indigo imperative panicked before pain took over, swallowing the spreading cracks that thundered in his mind. The third weapon had come out of nowhere, swinging his weapons wildly to force his opponent away. He moved awkwardly backwards with faltering steps. The first thing he felt when the pain allowed it was his wet temple being chilled by the wind. The first thought he had was that the helmet had held but cracked open. The second was that he had almost died like a mindless drone. A snicker came from his opponent, taunting, mocking. He had known about the two retracting claws. He had known, but the mimetic had forced it out of his mind. It had fought defensively, leaping away, barely deflecting his blade. Whenever he had managed to come in range, the fight had gone like this for a long time, his confidence glowing with every swing. The mimetic had shrieked and hissed with every dodge and parry. His moves almost panicked near the end, and all the while he now realized he had been growing angrier, more aggressive, more confident, ignoring his training and simply aiming for the kill. The cheers of his master's followers urged him on, roaring waves of voices rising at every swing. Now silence reigned beyond his pants, broken by the odd mocking cry from his opponent's supporters and the gurgling snicker of the mimetic before him. Surges of pheromantic emotions fell upon him from the crowd like landslides, threatening to crash his own feelings. The pain had stolen his focus and opened his perception to them, and only then did he realize the reason he had felt so certain of his victory, the reasons he had been so reckless. Much like the retracting claws, he had known about this trick too. He had known, but he had fallen prey to it anyway. Even now the mimetic's emissions were urging him, reassuring him of his victory before they changed, feeding him fear and despair. He almost fell prey to it once more. His salvation came from where it always did, among the waves the crowd had thrown at him. Anger, mockery, disgust, hatred. He singled one out, disappointment. His master's disappointment. He dared a quick glance at the balcony and saw him sitting there, silent, expressionless, next to the Directorate's biomancer that had pitted his mimetic against him. The indigo imperative looked at the mimetic. Enough tricks, enough games. This was war, much like the war his master had started with the humans. A war to silence doubt, a war to stay in control, a war to establish his young master as a force to be reckoned with, a power to be feared, a war he would win on his own. He took a defensive stance as the mimetic jumped at him hissing like an animal, four blades flashing with murderous intent. Stories of Ea, Dweghom, no end to their memories. Human historians often forget the world-shaking events that took place during the last century before the fall, absorbed by the half-forgotten truths of their own kind's misfortunes as they fled the Old Dominion. Few historians turn their attention to what the elder races were doing at the time, or even what was truly transpiring in the collapsing Dominion itself. Had they done so, perhaps the Dweghom would know of what had happened to their own kin that was caught in the devastation of the fall. While Capitus and the Dominion in general were being torn apart from within, the Dweghom were engaged en masse in the Exile campaign, an open war against exiles of all cultures and creeds. While the campaign was reportedly global, according to overseas human merchants and ambassadors, the most significant events happened in the lands of the Dominion, in a convergence of chaos and destruction that left no one in the area unaffected. Remnant Weaver enclaves were either annihilated or their populations fled. The most powerful human civilizations of the time was destroyed. An entire pantheon was torn down from the heavens. The Wadrhun claimed their freedom, and for the first time since their war with the dragons, At least 5 known spires were destroyed, either partially or completely. As for the Dweghom, their campaign was the cause of much of this mayhem, but their so-called victories did not come without a price. At least 3 hosts and their clans disappeared entirely from the continent of Surturus. Clan Onigudson of Hedgedom, Clan Kankalis of Goldodom, and Clan Arnson of Udom. These numbers and these names are largely incomplete. The fate of Clan Biddehism of Gaeldom is also not fully remembered. The largest part of its population is also considered lost to the fall, but a remnant force had been sent to the west to chase the fleeing weavers. They, in turn, met with the forces sent west by the Steelmancer Ishid of Clan Ofugarson of Endure, whose fate is also unknown but who did not perish during the fall. The 2 remnant forces, however, united, would come to claim Gordon, thus keeping their clan's memories alive. In reality, however, Biddehism and Ugharson are practically lost. The first was most likely caught by the destruction of the fall. The latter's fate is even more shameful, having helped the humans against their battle with their dead warriors. Steelmancer Ishidi and her remaining clan members simply disappeared. Technically, however, for the Dweghom, these 2 clans survive, even if diluted and diminished, and thus are not part of the aforementioned 3 who are part of the memory of loss. For the Dweghom, evidence and logic are not the same as memories. No memomancer has recorded the events of these clans' endings. None living remember what happened to them. This is not something new or unique to the 3 clans. Many times do individuals, often those that undertake the Dheukorro, get lost with their ends and the ends of their memories unrecorded and unwitnessed. Even if the term has come to refer mostly to the disappearance of the 3 clans during the fall, this is what the memory of lost means. Remembering those whose memories have no end. Ask any Dweghom, and indeed for all intents and purposes, those 3 clans are dead, claimed by the fall. That conclusion is not enough. How much had each clan claimed before it perished, if it perished, or what deeds were accomplished before death claimed them, if death claimed them? Uncertainty is not tolerated when a memory is preserved, and thus for the memory of loss, those clans and those individuals are still linger, for there is no end to their memory. The memory of loss is a sad destiny for any Dweghom in many ways. That fate is worse than being forgotten, for indeed they are being remembered. Sorrowful ghosts that linger but do not truly exist. Their names when uttered are always followed by, may loss forget them, and their memory end. So when 3 entire clans joined the ranks of lost memory, the very term came to mean their sad fate, a weight all Dweghom carry. There was a bright side to this for the rest of the world, a silver lining that could possibly keep the peace and holds back the tide of another Dweghom campaign. If the end of all 3 clans is not remembered, there is no memory of who is to blame for their loss. Would the exiles be blamed, and this happened during a campaign against them? Would the Old Dominion be held responsible? Or was their amateurish worship of minor primordials that led to destruction, and even in death their worship continues? If so, is there really a difference between dead humans and their living descendants? Woe to the fool that uncovers such truth. There is no telling what ending the Dweghom will offer to their memories. Stories of Ea, the Nord. Situation in Mannheim. While it could be easy to dismiss Nord culture and politics as crude, simple, and brutal, any who made that mistake would not survive for long. Brutal, yes. Crude and simple, no. It is easy to forget that Mannheim has seen the rule of dragons, the Yggdrasil, Spires, the Jotnar, and only recently that of man. All of these were cast down in cataclysmic battles, but their remnants still linger, stirring this frigid land. Arrayed against forces both seen and unseen stands the Nords, led by the Inariar, and a handful of others who know of the ancient nemesis that lurked in the frozen shadows of the north. Alas, only a handful of Inariar remain. Egbjorn the mountain, ensconced in Arnhelm, is doing his best to guide the budding civilization of Nords away from the many dangers that surround it. Greymane, the Wanderer, remains the first and last line of defense in the frozen north, fighting himself as much as the beasts that prowl the darkness. Orky, Deathbringer, remains a recluse who fights as and when he can. Beyond those, only a few more remain who can still communicate with men, let alone care for the fate of man. The rest have been lost. Whether to battle like Scarfilham or to their own bestial natures, it matters little. Their task would be difficult if conditions were ideal, and they were far from such. Nord society, once monolithic in support of the Inheriar, is riven through with tensions and simmering conflicts to the south. Prosperous reigning Jarls resent the tribute they pay the High King in Arnheim, when most of their prizes go to the Northern Jarls at the yearly Allmeet. Some return from their raids with massive treasures, the likes of which have not been seen in centuries, and they are loath to part with it. Arguments that the Northern Jarls have the hardest and least rewarding task of holding back that savage frontier fall upon deaf ears of their increasingly proud and prosperous southern kin. This alone would be nothing new. There have ever been tensions among the denizens of Mannheim, fueled by necessity and competition for resources, but there are many effective and straightforward ways to settle such differences in northern traditions. Now these traditions steadily give way to subterfuge and guile, beyond the field of single combat but leading to the battlefield. Sights of short and crooked shadows in the halls of many Jarls sow doubt and mistrust among peers, with honeyed words and promises of treasure, whispered in darkness. Thus emboldened, a few foolish Jarls have pushed things further than ever before. Wielding weapons of unprecedented craftsmanship, they have readily shed northern blood in one-sided duels that threaten to break out into full-fledged feuds among the Jarls. Thus would do nothing but weaken Nord society. Compounding this increasingly tense situation is the growing assertiveness of the Valkyrie cult. Although they profess a total devotion to the will of the living gods, it is difficult not to notice their views on how matters should be handled are often at odds with those of their chosen divinities, the Inheriar. A cynic would further quickly note that there are far more feasts and ceremonies around these Inheriar who have fallen in battle or devolved into bestial states than there are those who can voice an opinion that might disagree with their vision. Anbjorn, never the most cautious or careful of the Inheriar, has already clashed with the priesthood, but lacking their political savvy, he has been outwitted and isolated. The Valkyries would rebuke his efforts, recasting themselves as the victims of a cruel campaign of lies and misfortune, orchestrated by the shamans to foment bad blood between the Valkyries and their gods. The resulting repression of the shaman cult has weakened a critical pillar of support and counsel the Inheriar depend on to influence the more independent Jarls. Those now find their new attractive female advisors, the Vulva, irresistible in their court, as they have garnered power by agreeing with the Jarl's more ambitious and aggressive tendencies, instead of offering wise counsel. It would perhaps be natural for such seems to be the nature of man, Nord or otherwise, when prosperity and riches lie before them. Tensions inadvertently rise as competitors clash even in a land as dangerous as Mannheim. The dangers on the land are far more over for the Nords, and their division would seem untimely, suspicious so. In fact, bad omens increase in the readings of bones, runes, and entrails as the land itself shakes and shivers. Seers speak of giant serpents that stir in their sleep, and entire parties of hunters are lost without explanation or trace. Stalkers speak of unnatural monsters, the spawn of the mad god Loki, awaken once more and sow chaos without pattern, coercion, or purpose. And when the stalkers speak, the wise listen, and what they hear speaks of a reawakening in the far, far north. Still, this is far from a lost fight for the Nords. The Greymane has been seen south of the long ice for the first time in centuries. Some even claim to have seen him in Arnhelm, and speculated he has joined forces with Angbjorn, as they had of old. Following their savage call, the shamans have regrouped, rumored to be led by Anthung, the hoary ancient himself, first of the shamans and eldest of the Nords. They have begun exerting their power, reminding the Valkyries, the Nords, and their enemies that these old men still wield real power, and that not all power flows from the edge of the sword. To the careful observer, it is clear that Mannheim and the Nords are changing. The only question that remains is how. Stories of Ea, Wadrhun, building a civilization. It is often believed that the greatest challenge the Wadrhun ever faced was the fall, stranded under cold and darkness, while ashes of anything green and still settled around them. It is hard to imagine surviving the scarred wastelands as they did at the time. And yet, survive they did, and while the fall certainly exacted a heavy toll, the fledgling people would endure and find eventually the Hunati Oasis. Their true challenge, some cultists of famine sign, would still lie ahead, and yet it was their darkest of hours that the foundation of their thriving culture would be laid. Warriors without peer from their very inception, the Wadrhun would soon adapt to their new environment, becoming adept hunters, hunting down the monsters that would plague them and making the oasis safer for their population. It was during this period that the Wadrhun discovered the speakers among their own population. With their help, some of the creatures of the oasis would slowly be shaped into cautious companions and beasts of burden. What is more, their goddess would have them forge a proper unified form of communication for her people, uniquely adapted to their physiology, equipped with weapons other than the ones they had held, and with these oases providing enough resources to secure at least the survival of their small numbers. The fledgling race could look forward to understanding and evolving in the world around it rather than simply surviving in it. Primal engineering and material management began, and the foundations of the true settlements were laid. For the first time, rather than efforts being concentrated on the preservation of the population, numbers grew. Thinking her people were safe and the times ahead prosperous, the Yukon Fazine sought to explore the world to find what other threats and opportunities existed. She left her people and put her protege in charge of steering and protecting the population in her absence. But the very inexperienced and naive she sought to address through her travels would cost her people in her absence. The relative safety the population enjoyed during this time would soon prove fragile. As the population expanded, the demands placed on the nascent Wadrhun society by their own dietary requirements and the incredibly hostile nature of the environment slowly forced them to adopt a mentality of ruthless pragmatism. The strong were revered and the weak were abandoned, and while their numbers still grew, hope slowly vanished behind a facade of barbarianism justified by necessity. Division was inevitable, as different groups would gather round or be forced to follow stronger individuals that were capable of securing food. These chieftains, who would raise banners and fight between them, were ruthless and brutal, carving deep lines between the different groups until, as generations passed, these groups and banners would give birth to the concept of tribes. Many of them, usually the weakest, were driven to the outskirts of the oasis, forced to scrap a living from whatever they could steal. Some fled the oasis entirely, knowing nothing of the world beyond. The luckiest among them would find other oases spawned by the rest of the fallen Spires. Others would learn to survive from the meek offerings of the wasteland, occasionally raiding the richer tribes, only to flee to the wasteland once more. Some, however, would be lost forever, their names, banners, and chieftains forgotten because of their weakness. Upon her return, the goddess looked upon her people and despaired. Trapped in her prolonged lifespan, she realized that for her short-lived people, decades had been enough to reduce them to violence and brutality once more. Driven by circumstance and the unfettered influence of the primes in their blood alike, she had traveled the world, beheld the ruined marvels of the Old Dominion, and the arcing technological majesty of the city-states. She had traveled through the teeming populations of the kingdoms, discovered writing, literature, drama, music, only to return and find her people encircled in a dark pit of barbarism and cruelty. Seeing no other solution, she personally took control of the tribes, slaying countless would-be clansmen and challengers, while even tempered and gracious to those who capitulated. She had no compunction in exhausting these tribes she saw as too far gone. She waded into the fight for the soul of the Wadrhun race itself, embracing her divinity as a tool to force the tribes to adapt to a new way of doing things. And yet, for all its wonder and majesty, the world she had met in her travels was neither a peaceful nor a safe place. Her people had ventured down a path she had never wished for them. This much was true, and one she thought had proven their ultimate destruction, had they been allowed to walk it to the end. Yet, in their division and warmongering, her people had remained industrious, and the Yukon Fazine was not one to disregard what she saw as gifts, if properly controlled. What lessons they had learned harshly about survival, about fighting, about the dangers of the oasis and the scarce gifts of the wasteland, the goddess would adopt and ensure their knowledge was passed down from one generation to the next. During her absence, the speakers, once tools for the advancement and security of the forming civilization, had weaponized their gift and with it, their beasts. This, she knew, would provide to be an asset to her people. The division into tribes offered versatility, and their clashes would keep them well trained and experienced, without posing a civilization-ending threat. They had even expanded their territory, discovering new oases, new beasts, new tools for the entire people to use. Despite the adoration she enjoyed, her work was neither easy nor fast, not for her people anyway. She had taught a new language for everyday use, one influenced by the one used by humans, and through it she had promoted storytelling and singing, while the mystifying language and primal chants the speakers had developed were turned into tools of war to ensure communication in battle. Violent and primitive customs such as binding enemies into servitude to provide food for the tribe would be turned into the practice of the bound. She would channel and shackle the violent practices of individuals strongly influenced by the strands of her dead siblings onto rituals and traditions that offered them purpose. Only this time, the short lifespan of her worshippers would provide a boon to her. It took little more than a century for the Yukon Fazine to change the foundation of the civilization of the tribes. Since then, the Wadrhun have expanded and even prospered where none other dared to venture. The oasis became permanent, almost peaceful settlements, large enough to resemble proper towns, led by a defined hierarchy with specific succession rules. Tribes outside of the oasis led perhaps a harsher life. Their strength, however, would remain such that new settlements would be founded in the once ash-covered, then rich and bountiful fields of the Old Dominion. While in time, these were abandoned and those tribes are forced into a nomadic lifestyle once more. The lifestyle, peace, and prosperity they had offered were kept alive through tribal storytelling traditions, provided for a new division, new aspirations, and new ways of life for the tribes. During the centuries that followed, the Wadrhun society as we know it today was shaped based on distinct roles, practices, and groups of influence, forming a civilization with goals, aspirations, and a vision for the future. Stories of Ea, Old Dominion. Is the Dheukorro a dead end? Elena, I have long been vexed by the notion of what N. Calamus writes in his Descentia prelude. Down deep we must go. Down deep where the brother broke. Down deep we must go. Down and down again under the darkest cloak. There they lie, infinite worlds untold, under the soil, under the earth, under a Dweghom hold. There they lie, borders without end. Their mind, soul, and matter, there they all bend. Now, since I have no doubt that you have in fact come closer to putting your hands in open flames than you have to opening the Descentica, allow me to explain. When not rhymed badly, Encalmus was considered THE authority on all matters Dweghom. In fact, his Descentica is the holy book of all scholars who, for whatever reason, seem infatuated by these destructive short savages. Even today, our breath-affiliated descendants in the West would likely accept the Lord's embrace were I to offer them a mere peek of the cover of my surviving copy. Following me so far? Good. Now, this 642-page treatise on the Sons of War, as he calls them, is indeed filled to the brim with information about them. I say information, however I subject a large amount as theories as apart from this, admirable remarkable. Admittedly remarkable. As part of this, admittedly remarkable. Work on their language and rune system. He admits he presented what he had extrapolated from scattered conversations with members of their species, which I suspect must have amounted to a grand total of quarter watch at best. Still, all things considered, Enkimus had done a thorough job at gathering materials from other writers. From the amassed knowledge of the Collegia, and being a Magos himself, even from the Magi's Apocrypha, his findings are indeed limited but insightful, and they span anything from history and modern social structure to philosophical debates. Their incoherable social standing system, nutritious needs and habits, etc., to the language he dedicates, without exaggeration, half this book. To the rest he dedicates 49.9%. But then there's that 0.1. Dedicating no more than a few paragraphs, Enkimus speaks of a tradition one cast member undertakes ritualistically. Although none is barred from performing it either, it is called the Dheukorro, which he translates to descent, and during it the Dweghom simulate the path their ancestors took before the breaking. Surely, Enkimus writes, and I quote, "This is an appropriate and adorable little tradition that benefits their mythology." He explains not what mythology he refers to, nor does he mention this tradition elsewhere in his book. But then he names it Descentica, and rather unfittingly, has a poem in his prelude urging that down, down we must go. Prelude entitled best reflect the subject of a few paragraphs in a 642 pages. Why? I can think of two possible reasons as to why. One has to do with the very tangible disdain our Lord holds for the Dweghom. While scientific analysis was ever encouraged in his domain, I think we can admit that there were some restrictions in the past. Second is that Enkimus was a Magos. Seeking knowledge beyond our Lord's tolerance was what those blasphemous bastards lived for, wasn't it? That and flaunting knowledge they possessed but did not share, especially with their peers. What better way for Enkimus to tell his entire blasphemous community that he knew something he both wasn't supposed to, and which they didn't, than putting it in plain sight as well? Much as I admire the man's playful nature in this matter, I of course condemn his practice and his hubris in seeking knowledge beyond what the Lord allowed at the time. Today, however, it is his will that we know all, and we reach all. If there were corridors without end, I want to traverse them, and with the Lord's gift, I have an attorney to put their description to test. More importantly, however, if there is infinite worlds untold, I want to bring the Lord's gift to them. Now wouldn't that humble our first among equals? What say you? F. Stories of Ea. The City-States. Myths and Reality. Considering the youth of the city-state civilization, the number of myths and legends that permeate their culture is staggering. In a scant few hundred years, an elaborate mosaic of heroes, monsters, and deities have been establishing themselves in the minds of the population, to the point where few everyday discussions do not include some form of reference to persons and places that may or may not have existed. Unparalleled art has been sculpted, painted, and created to depict entirely or almost entirely fictional characters and scenes, while poetry, epics, and theater around the cities retell the stories on an almost daily basis. The natural question one could feel inclined to ask is simple: why? Are the people of the city so much more inclined to mythos? Do they suffer from a mysterious mass affliction that sees the most scientifically grounded breaking human civilization turn to fables? Considering the origins of their civilization, the scientific minds that mold so many aspects of their society, and especially their founder, who had meticulously planned each detail of their existence, one would expect a level-headed society that would put reason before fantasy and history before myths. And yet at first glance, the city-states present a collection of tales that seemingly dwarf those of the kingdoms and rival the likes of the Nords. The answer to these questions is not straightforward, and the reason can only be theorized in their multitude. It would, for instance, readily claim that the question is without merit, as the phenomenon under discussion is non-existent. The city-states do not in any quantifiable measure have more myths than the 100 Kingdoms or the Nords. In fact, quite the opposite is true. The amassed collection of mythologies stemming from the various cultures of the kingdoms far outweigh that of the city-states, while the far older traditions of the Nords would draw in their plethora of tales of city bards. The illusion of the opposite stems from the cultural differences, or their lack of thereof. Unlike the Hundred Kingdoms, the culture of the city-states is more cohesive, its structure far more similar in its core than it is different. By and large, the people of different cities are divided by dialect rather than entirely different languages, and the historians have more in common than they have different. This allowed for an accumulation of mythologies of sorts under a facet of unity, and indeed, in time, such a unity did begin to take shape. As the language allowed for the tales to be readily exchanged, the themes to be repeated and refitted until an almost unified mythology was forged. While in the case of the kingdoms, there is an assortment of different mythologies that, in order to spread, has to be reshaped beyond recognition or live on in an echo chamber of the same group that birthed them. At the same time, unlike the Nords who rely on their oral traditions, the love for theater and the widespread use of written word allowed for an almost scientific approach to any mythos, as tales were meticulously recorded, repeated, and perfected, being elevated from simple fables to educational and philosophical tales, which aim to explore human nature and thus resonate with the same strength throughout the generations. Should one take a closer look at these tales, however, the differences in details and delivery of the same myth from city to city reveal the truth behind these false single united mythology. This theory can be challenged by another view. While not dismissing any of its arguments, one could note that all aforementioned factors in fact be viewed as tools rather than natural or accidental occurrences. Recognizing the immense challenge of detaching his people from millennia of the respective cultural histories, both of the overwhelming cultural influences of Hazazel's theocracy, but also from the different tribal groups within the Dominion. Palatine must have realized that a cohesive culture would be paramount to the success of his vision. Least divisions of the past resurface without the presence of an all-powerful patron deity to limit them. And yet, as such a deity was exactly what Palatine sought to avoid to recreate, something had to take its place. In order for the population of the different cities to feel connected but distinct, much like their deities, perhaps among the many lessons he learned from his own god's history, Palatine understood that an elaborate but unified mythology allowed for different people to feel connected and part of the whole. Despite their differences, while at the same time no single aspect of that mythos would dominate the spiritual landscape, this instance to educate the population. His goal to promote theater to the point where they were incorporated to the very image of a good citizen becomes less of an enlightened path and more of a planned route. Of course, none can say with certainty if such expectations are true or not. If any of the city gods or the scholar are privy to the inner workings of the founder's mind, their lips remain hermetically sealed on such matters. In the end, the answers could be simple, like many if not most myths of their cultural counterparts on the continent. There is an actual truth behind the fantasies, events and their exaggeration as the time passed, and people that were elevated based on a single moment of glory. After all, there is no shortage of such tales on Ea. Thank you for listening to the second episode of Storytime. I hope everyone enjoyed this one. More will come out each month, like I plan to do an episode a month. If you're interested in more BonkTable content, we have a podcast, battle reports on the YouTube channel, and we have a Discord. You can get all those links in the description below. And I hope you guys all have a great day. Bye!